So I'm just going to end with these questions now. How do you go about mitigating risk? Well, you could say, like Steve Arnott, maybe for a short period of time, I can limit access to the information. We can talk about that. That's a difficult thing to do, especially in today's world. Very difficult. And there may be only a very small number of cases where that even could be contemplated, unless the work began in a classified setting, which this, of course, did not. Well, in addition, shouldn't we raise awareness? Shouldn't we sensitize a number of kinds of communities so that they become like Steve Arnott? Maybe they self-censor, or they don't even undertake an experiment like Ron Fouchier, so that they look for an alternative approach to the scientific question that leads to less risk. So that would be at the bottom-up level, the individual. Maybe there ought to also be norms and examples or even regulation provided by local professional organizations, perhaps national groups at the governmental level, perhaps at the international level. Maybe all of the above, E. In addition, is there some value in trying to, in some way, anticipate the kinds of threats that may arise and be a bit better prepared for them? And then finally, and maybe try to preempt them, maybe convince people who are beginning to work on something that we clearly see as a disproportionate danger, that perhaps they ought not to do that. And then, in addition, because all of these things together are inevitably going to fail, what about a response capability that's a little bit better than what we've got now? So I thought I would just put these up and go actually skip them. How much time do we have? Another 10 minutes or so? 12 minutes? So let me just tell you, there's been some thinking about this problem of dual-use research. The original definition was military versus civilian use. Then it became sort of bad versus good, beneficial versus harmful. Different perspectives, actually. There's always been the sense that maybe there's a bright line between fundamental or basic work, which ought to remain open, even though it may have implications of risk, and applied work, which is much further along the path towards the production of a risky product or set of information. And that's maybe something that we could talk about as well. I actually think that that bright line may not be so bright anymore, whereas perhaps it used to be. And there are groups now that have been thinking about this, and I still think there's a lot more that we need to do. So here are the last sort of sets of questions. On that raising awareness and sensitizing bit, how do we do that, actually? And how do we go about helping people assess risks and benefits? In terms of governance, should we be focused more on a top-down model, meaning national or international government, or more at the bottom-up level, the individuals who are already thinking ahead and talking to their buddies down the hall? Who else should be talking about this? Every time, well, when the bird flu thing was in the news, I'd get into a taxi cab, and sometimes you get into these conversations of what do you do, and I would instead ask them whether they'd heard about this bird flu thing, and a lot of times they had, not surprisingly. And then you ask, well, what do you think? And a lot of, I'm just using taxi cab driver as just a representative of the rest of society. Well, they say, I have an opinion about this, number one. Number two, I think this doesn't make sense, or I'd like to understand better why someone would do such a crazy sounding thing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These people were not asked. These people, meaning you, everyone else. It was a discussion about the flu researchers and the national science, funding agencies. Those were the people at the table before. And so I think it's going to have to be a much broader discussion. So how do you do that? Who are the representatives of the rest of society? This is about restricted information and whether that's a mechanism we ought to use. So here, finally, if we step back even further, are there experiments that simply shouldn't be undertaken? When I say that, especially in places like Stanford Medical School, you would not believe how people get upset. How dare you suggest that, the free and open practice of an obviously beneficial activity like science be curtailed in any way, or even talk about it? But to me, if we don't talk about this, we're sort of missing the boat. And I do think you'd get agreement if you could get past the initial shock of even discussing the topic. Because there are plenty of people, well-respected people in science, who will concede that perhaps the Ron Fouchier experiment was not such a great idea. And what's our obligation to have these discussions? Both ethical, moral, social, etc. There was an interesting example from the past, just down the coast here in Asilomar near Pacific Grove, a conference called the Asilomar Conference to discuss, at that time, the new technology of recombinant DNA engineering. And what happened was, it was all new. So the 200 people who even knew what this was could get together in one place and talk about it. And what they decided was they were going to wait. They were going to put a moratorium on the science. They were going to wait a year or two, have some meetings, talk about risk, try to assess it scientifically, see if there really were real risks. And then they ended up creating regulations through the NIH that are still in place today. Now, could you do this again today? That would be a tough thing. You can't get a 200 group people together to talk about genetic engineering of the sort I'm telling you about because everyone already knows how to do it. So you've got to have a different kind of discussion, maybe a bunch of them, maybe for different related purposes. But it's this kind of setting, this kind of dynamic that I think would be important. So that's basically what I wanted to raise for you. I'd be happy to talk about any of these issues as questions. Bottom line, we're living in a revolutionary time, in case you didn't realize it. The benefits are almost unimaginable. The risks are perhaps up there as well. And there are probably a whole number of strategies, no one of which is going to solve this problem. But together, they may reduce the overall risk and improve the benefit and yield. So I'll stop there. Happy to entertain questions, get you to get talking about this. Thanks for your attention. Yes?
Yeah, so assuming that there was a situation where a terrorist unleashed a biological weapon, say like an airport, is there any forensic data that scientists and authorities could use to figure out where that virus came from or who developed it?
The question is, suppose something bad happened and an agent, an infectious agent, a biological agent appears out of the blue somewhere. At an airport was the example. What are our means of determining its origins? Who, why, where? All of the usual, forensic kind of questions. So if you had asked this question in 2000, the answer would be not so good. Not so good. Actually, haven't really thought about this in a whole lot of detail. The U.S. government. 2002, it's a somewhat different story because of the anthrax letters. So the FBI basically had to create a whole new coordinated community of researchers into this whole topic of microbial forensics. It was kind of a new topic for them. And that began, a form of science, applied science, that has improved. So today, it kind of depends on exactly which agent. For some, we have much better databases, a better sense of what is where in nature, of evolutionary patterns of population structure, so as to understand what a new thing might mean, whether it belongs there and how it got there. In other cases, not so. So if you were the perpetrator, you'd want to pick something for which we have a lesser capability or enough capability to obfuscate. You could deliberately release something that looked like it came from somewhere else, perhaps a place belonging to one of your enemies or whomever. So it is a very tough problem, but fortunately there's a lot more going on now than there was. Yes?
So the example you gave with Steve Arnon was scientists deciding themselves who to share sensitive information with in order to prevent it from being used for harmful purposes. What do you see as the role of government in regulating who this information is shared with, if at all?
It's a great question. The question is, if we talk about the scenario where we have a well-intentioned, sensitized scientist who stumbles upon sensitive information and decides maybe this is something that ought to be controlled in some way, what's the role of government as a partner? I think it's difficult right now. Our government recognizes that it has a legitimate and important role, A. B, it's set up a few boards, advisory boards, both within government and with external advisors, to try to talk about how to define what might be more sensitive and less sensitive. What are the mechanisms for restricting sensitive information? It turns out to be, of course, even more complicated than anyone had thought because, well, you've got FOIA. If it's governmentally funded work, you could put in a FOIA request. Well, there are FOIA exemptions maybe that apply, but they don't quite apply. Do you need a new one? Can you use existing ones? What about export control on the other side? If something were funded with public money for the purpose of just general science, and suddenly you restrict its dissemination, it's now exempt from export control, i.e. it becomes subject to export control. Now, the Department of Commerce says, we determine to whom you can share, under what circumstance, et cetera, et cetera. It still comes down to what is it that we're most concerned about, and are there reasonable mechanisms that don't overly hinder the proper conduct of science and yet are mindful of the risks. And that's not a great answer. It's tough. There are people thinking about it. My personal opinion, right now, this year, our government is a little bit hands-off this issue because they got burned a little bit 2 years ago with this bird flu story, and they're realizing how hard it is, and they would rather just kind of hope for the best and move on. That's just my personal opinion. One more question. Here.
Do you think it's better to focus, or do you think it's more important to focus on like rapid containment or detection and containment of a bio threat rather than like regulating life sciences? Because it seems like there are already so many like almost like bio nuke type weapons, like there's so many like diseases.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, maybe you remember the list of ways of mitigating the risk? Maybe we should focus on that bottom one. Just get much better at responding because we're just not going to be able to stop everything, and nor should we be trying, maybe. Maybe that's part of the question. A completely legitimate question and proposal, in part because nature's already making these things, right? So I didn't show you a map of all the emerging infections around the globe, but they're everywhere. So we ought to be much better at doing that anyway. So it's really hard to argue with you on that. In fact, it would actually just further emphasize the importance of strengthening the public health system, which we, by the way, have allowed to kind of become ragged and fall apart a bit. It's really gotten pretty decrepit, at least in some states right now, and it's sad. But we've got to be doing that. I would say yes to all.
I think that's all we have time for, so please join